Hello, and welcome back. I'm Nathan. Today I have 5 Karen stories where having followers made them fearless in the worst possible way. From a Karen who showed up uninvited to an active gun range, to a Karen who lied her way onto a jump plane and found out that arrogance does not open parachutes. It was a Saturday morning in late October 2017 in a small town on the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona. The air was dry, the range was open, and by mid-morning, everything had already gone wrong. Marcy Delvo was 41 years old and lived alone in a single-story home about 2 miles from the gun range that had been her personal enemy for the better part of a year. On top of her part-time work, Marcy ran a local advocacy YouTube channel she had started in early 2016. It was not large, a few hundred subscribers, but it was consistent. She posted videos documenting what she called community negligence, usually targeting local businesses or services she believed were operating without accountability. The gun range had already appeared in 2 of her uploads before that morning, both framing it as a noise hazard that local channels had failed to address. But Marcy had a particular quality that the people around her knew well. She did not let things go. A noise complaint that most people would file once and forget about was, for Marcy, the beginning of a campaign. She had contacted the range ownership multiple times over the course of several months. None of it produced the result she wanted, which was the range shutting down, or, at a minimum, limiting its hours significantly. What I find interesting about Marcy is that she was not entirely wrong about the noise. People who lived near that range had complained before. The difference was that everyone else eventually moved on. Marcy never did. By late 2017, she had convinced herself that showing up in person was the only way anyone would take her seriously. That belief, more than anything else, is what put her there. That morning, she arrived at the range just before 10. It was a Saturday, which meant the place was active. Several shooters were already on the lanes, bags down, running through their sessions. Marcy walked past the entry signage without stopping and made her way toward the main area where the range owner was speaking with a group near the far end. She was not there to listen. She had already decided how the conversation was going to go. The argument that followed was loud enough that multiple people on the range stopped what they were doing. Witnesses later described her as agitated from the moment she arrived, pointing toward the surrounding neighborhood and raising her voice steadily as the owner tried to respond. It went on for several minutes with neither side getting anywhere. That kind of standoff, where the other person just will not hear you, reminds me of something I talked about in an earlier episode. That specific dynamic where someone walks in with a conclusion already formed and treats the conversation as a formality. You cannot reason with that. You can only wait for it to end. What happened next took only a few seconds. At some point during the confrontation, Marcy turned toward a nearby bench where a shooter had set down his range bag between sessions. The bag was unzipped. She reached into it. Witnesses said it looked deliberate, like she was trying to pull the firearm out to make a point about how carelessly weapons were handled on the property. The shooter, whose bag it was, had stepped back from the bench and was standing a few feet away. Nobody had time to react. The firearm was chambered. The moment her grip tightened and her fingers slipped inside the trigger guard and pressed the trigger as she pulled it free, it discharged. The shot entered her upper right abdomen. She went down immediately. I think about that a lot. The shooter was right there. The bag was right there. Not a single person in that space expected her to reach in. That is the thing about someone who is fully committed to making a point. They stop calculating risk entirely. Other shooters moved toward her. There was nothing that could be done at that point. Marcy Delvo was pronounced dead later that afternoon. The cause was a single gunshot wound to the upper abdomen, resulting in fatal damage to her liver and the vessels surrounding it. Blood loss was the determining factor. The manner of death was ruled accidental. The shooter faced no charges, given that he had not been in contact with the firearm at the moment it discharged. The range remained open. The case was closed. She came to that range to prove a point about danger, and the range proved it back. The next one is hard to watch in your head. A Phoenix woman, a wasp nest, and a can from her garage that sealed everything in under 2 minutes. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late July 2016 in a residential neighborhood on the eastern edge of Phoenix, Arizona. The temperature had already pushed past 104 degrees, and most people on the block had the good sense to stay inside. Cora Belson was 38 years old and owned a modest single-story home on a quiet street she had lived on for nearly 6 years. Alongside her bookkeeping work, Cora ran a home and property blog she had been building since 2015. It had grown steadily to a few thousand readers, mostly homeowners interested in renovation and property management. She wrote with authority on everything from landscaping to boundary disputes, and her readers trusted her recommendations. The fence situation with her neighbor had made it into at least one post, framed as a case study in how to handle difficult neighbors on your own terms. Cora was the kind of neighbor who kept a mental log and acted on every item, whose trash can stayed out too long, whose dog wandered too close to her garden, whose fence post leaned 2 inches in the wrong direction. She addressed all of it, directly, and without much patience, for pushback. Her neighbors knew better than to dismiss her complaints. That never went well for anyone. The dispute with the man next door had been building all summer over a section of shared fencing where Cora believed he had made modifications without consulting her. From that point forward, anything connected to that fence was a matter of principle, and she had made that clear to anyone who would listen. So when he noticed a wasp nest on that same fence post in mid-July and told her it was large enough to need a professional, that he had already looked into getting someone out, Cora shut it down immediately. It was her fence, her nest, and her call. He backed off. He had learned by then that pushing back only made things worse. Being given a way out and still rejecting it, not for a better plan, but because it felt like losing, that kind of stubbornness quietly closes off options before you even realize it. She did not call anyone else either. A few days after that conversation, she went into her garage and came back out with an aerosol can she was confident would handle it. Based on what was found at the scene, the can was a general-purpose household lubricant spray, not a wasp or hornet-specific product. It would have done nothing to a colony of that size under any circumstances. She approached the nest with no protective clothing, no gloves, nothing covering her face or neck. That choice alone tells you everything about where her head was that afternoon. She began spraying directly at the nest from close range. The spray did not disperse the colony. What it did was agitate it. Within seconds, the wasps responded. 2 neighbors observed what followed, one from a driveway 2 houses down, and the man next door who had stepped outside at the sound of the commotion. Both described the swarm as immediate and concentrated, targeting her face and neck almost entirely. She stumbled backward onto the lawn within roughly 90 seconds of the first sting. That margin, 90 seconds, is something that genuinely unsettles me. She was on her own property, in broad daylight, with neighbors close enough to see everything, and none of that made any difference once it started. She had no documented history of a diagnosed allergy. But an undetected sensitivity to wasp venom is more common than most people realize, and a concentrated number of stings to the face and throat accelerates anaphylaxis in ways that even a mild underlying sensitivity cannot withstand. Her airway was compromised before anyone reached her. The neighbor next door was the first to get to her. There was nothing he could do by that point. Cora Belson did not survive the afternoon. The cause of death was anaphylactic shock triggered by multiple wasp stings concentrated around her face and neck, with findings confirming an undiagnosed hypersensitivity to the venom. The incident was ruled accidental. No one else was held responsible, including the neighbor who had already warned her, and the case was closed shortly after. What got me about Cora's story is that the solution was already there, yet she turned it down because of a fence dispute. Third story is about a woman who have already decided exactly what procedure she needed and talked someone into performing it on her neck. If you are still here after that one, chances are this is your kind of channel. Subscribing to Fatal Files takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps me keep going. It was a Thursday morning in early March 2017 in a mid-sized neighborhood on the northern edge of Denver, Colorado. The sidewalks were still damp from an overnight frost, and the morning had barely warmed up by the time Denise Gruzdek walked through the front door of a small chiropractic office a few blocks from her home. Denise Gruzdek was 44 years old and worked as an office administrator for a small property management company. Outside of her day job, Denise hosted a small podcast she had. Launched in late 2015, built around the idea that patients who push back got better outcomes than those who simply followed what they were told. It had a few thousand regular listeners by early 2017, and chiropractic care had come up more than once as something she believed the medical community was too quick to dismiss. She had been dealing with chronic neck stiffness for the better part of 2 years. She had seen a general practitioner about it once, received a referral for physical therapy, and dismissed it without a second thought. Physical therapy, in her view, was for people who did not know how to advocate for themselves. She had done her own research and she knew what would fix it. That research consisted almost entirely of videos she had been watching online for several months. Chiropractic adjustment clips, specifically high-velocity cervical manipulations, had become a regular habit. She watched them the way some people watch tutorials, forming opinions and building what she believed was a working understanding of the procedure. By early 2017, she had fully convinced herself that a single aggressive neck adjustment was all she needed and that the only reason she had not gotten one was because no practitioner had been willing to do it properly. That distinction between watching something and understanding it is one that gets people killed more often than I think anyone wants to admit. She booked an appointment at a chiropractic office near her home and arrived with her mind already made up. When the practitioner completed his initial assessment and recommended a conservative course of treatment, starting with soft tissue work and gradual mobilization, Denise rejected it immediately. She told him his approach was too cautious and that her research had already told her what she needed. She was not aggressive about it. She was composed, certain, and completely immovable, which, if anything, is harder to deal with than someone who is just loudly difficult. The practitioner offered alternatives. Denise declined each one. She made it clear she would not be coming back if he was unwilling to perform what she was asking for. He eventually agreed, on the condition that she sign a standard consent form outlining the known risks of the procedure, including, explicitly, the possibility of vascular injury. Denise signed it without reading it and booked a follow-up for the following week. I find it hard to decide which part is worse, that she was warned in writing or that she treated it like a receipt. She returned the next Thursday. The high-velocity cervical manipulation was performed. Within roughly 3 minutes, she told the practitioner she had a sudden and severe headache at the base of her skull. She lost consciousness in the chair shortly after. A receptionist and one other patient in the waiting area heard the commotion and witnessed the immediate aftermath. What had occurred was a vertebral artery dissection, a tear in one of the arteries running along the cervical spine that supplies blood to the brainstem. It is a documented, though uncommon, complication of high-velocity cervical manipulation, and the brainstem stroke that followed was rapid and irreversible. I think about the consent form whenever a story lands here. She was told it was written down in plain language, and she moved past it without a second thought. The medical examiner determined that Denise died as a result of a brainstem stroke caused by vertebral artery dissection following a high-velocity cervical manipulation. A formal review was conducted, during which the signed consent form and the documented record showing that Denise had explicitly requested the procedure against the practitioner's initial recommendation were entered as central evidence. The practitioner was not charged. She was certain, she was prepared, and she was wrong in every way that mattered. The next one genuinely unsettled me. A woman who spent years telling her followers the food industry was lying to them proved herself fatally wrong one morning. It was a Saturday morning in mid-January 2017 in a quiet residential neighborhood on the western edge of Portland, Oregon. The sky was flat and gray the way it gets in January out there, and the streets were mostly empty by the time Petra Windholm sat down at her kitchen counter and started preparing what she had decided would be the centerpiece of her entire wellness philosophy. Petra Windholm was 36 years old and lived with her husband in a mid-century home she had spent years renovating into what she described on her blog as a chemical-free, intentional living space. She worked occasional shifts at a small, natural food store, but her real investment was the wellness blog she had been running since 2014. It was not large by any measurable standard, but it had a loyal readership, and Petra treated it with the seriousness of a full-time occupation. The blog covered what she called ancestral nutrition, a loose philosophy built around the idea that modern food processing had destroyed the nutritional integrity of everything most people ate. She wrote about sourcing, about organic certification, about the dangers of cooking at high temperatures, and what she believed it did to enzymes and nutrients. Her readers trusted her, and she wrote with the kind of confidence that tends to read as authority even when it is not. By late 2016, she had become particularly focused on raw organ meat. Through forums and self-published wellness literature, rather than any clinical source, she had become convinced that raw beef liver was among the most nutrient-dense foods a person could consume, and that cooking it destroyed the very compounds that made it valuable. She began working toward what she planned to present as her most definitive post yet, a raw liver protocol she had developed herself, intended as proof that everything her critics had been saying about food, safety, was nothing more than industry-driven fear. Critics had been vocal for months, including one claiming to be a nutritionist, but Petra dismissed them all, calling their concerns overblown and even removing some of the criticism from her blog entirely. That last part is what gets me. She was not just confident, she was actively cutting out the voices telling her to slow down. She sourced what she believed was a premium grass-fed beef liver from a local supplier and stored it in her refrigerator for 2 days before use. Raw beef liver carries a significant salmonella risk that proper cooking eliminates entirely, but that no amount of sourcing quality can guarantee against. Petra knew the concern existed and had addressed it on her blog before, arguing that organic certification made it irrelevant. It did not. On the morning of January 14th, she prepared and consumed a substantial portion of the liver raw. Her husband was home and later recounted that she had been in good spirits, treating the whole thing as a milestone. Symptoms began within 18 hours, nausea first, then cramping, and a steadily climbing fever. Petra attributed it to what she called a detox response and did not seek any help, telling her husband the same thing she had told her readers for years, that the body knew how to handle itself if you gave it the right inputs. By the 3rd day, she could not keep anything down. Her husband brought her in for care on January 17th. The infection had already progressed significantly. Salmonella was confirmed and her condition continued to deteriorate over the following 2 days despite intervention. Petra Windholm died on January 19th, 2017, 5 days after consuming the raw liver. The cause of death was septic shock, resulting from a severe Salmonella enterica infection, confirmed as originating from the raw beef liver she had prepared at home. Her husband had urged her to seek help 2 days before she agreed to, by which point the infection had already advanced beyond what treatment could reverse. The manner of death was ruled accidental, and the case was concluded without further proceedings. Petra spent years dismantling every warning that could have saved her, and in the end, she was the one who handed herself the last one. Up next is the Reno story that made me pause. A woman who argued her way onto a jump plane and skipped every check that would have kept her alive. It was a Sunday afternoon in late August 2016. On the outskirts of Reno, Nevada, the sky was clear, the wind conditions were good, and the drop zone was running its regular weekend schedule when Claudia Volser walked in and decided she had a problem with the way things were being run. Claudia Volser was 39 years old and lived in a mid-sized apartment complex in central Reno. She had built a consumer accountability blog alongside her warehouse career, centered on exposing what she called predatory business practices in the Reno area. It had a loyal readership that engaged regularly with her warnings and recommendations. She had posted about the drop zone twice before that Sunday, once questioning its pricing structure and once suggesting its safety protocols were theater designed to justify charging more. She had come to the drop zone that afternoon with a coworker who had a tandem jump booked. Claudia had no booking, no experience, and no prior exposure to skydiving in any formal capacity. She was there as a spectator. that lasted about 20 minutes. What appears to have irritated her first was the length of the pre-jump instruction her coworker was receiving. She watched the lead instructor walk through the safety briefing and equipment orientation and made it known to the people around her that the whole process was being drawn out unnecessarily. When the instructor moved into the equipment demonstration, she approached him directly and told him he was overcomplicating something that was not that complicated. The instructor redirected her and continued. Claudia did not let it go. The argument that followed was witnessed by several people in the staging area, other jumpers, staff members, and a small group of spectators near the hangar. Witnesses described her as escalating steadily, telling the instructor that his job was not as technical as he was making it out to be, and that the entire operation was designed to extract money from people by making them feel like they needed more preparation than they actually did. The instructor eventually walked away from the conversation entirely. That is when Claudia turned her attention to a younger staff member who had been standing nearby. That shift from the person who would not give her what she wanted to the one who might is something I have seen in almost every story on this channel where someone talks their way into something fatal. The lead instructor had held his ground. The younger staff member was newer, less certain, and had just watched a confrontation he was not equipped to navigate. Claudia told him she had completed AFF training at another drop zone. She had not, and that she just needed to be cleared for a solo jump. The staff member, assuming prior certification and failing to verify it through the system, relented. What should have followed was a complete equipment inspection, a solo jump assessment, an altitude and body position briefing, and a review of both primary and reserve deployment procedures. None of that happened. Claudia was issued a parachute rig that had been repacked earlier that week by a junior rigger. The required inspection and sign-off from a certified senior rigger had not yet been completed, a lapse that should have grounded the equipment. Claudia put the rig on with minimal oversight, was cleared through manifest without her credentials being properly verified, boarded the jump aircraft with a group of experienced jumpers, and said nothing to anyone about her actual experience level. Every checkpoint she skipped was a decision, not an oversight. She exited the aircraft at approximately 10,000 feet. The primary parachute deployed, but entered a line twist configuration that significantly reduced its ability to slow her descent. That kind of malfunction has a practiced response that experienced jumpers train for repeatedly. Claudia had no training. The reserve parachute, her last option, did not deploy correctly, a failure that the subsequent review linked directly to the improper repack. Several people on the ground witnessed the descent and the impact. Staff reached her within moments. There was nothing to be done. The formal review that followed reconstructed the full sequence. The junior staff member who granted her access without verification, the uncertified repack that had never been signed off by a senior rigger, and Claudia's own decision to misrepresent her experience level and walk past every checkpoint the facility had in place. Investigators noted that while multiple failures had contributed, the chain began the moment Claudia lied to someone who was not in a position to push back. She was pronounced dead at the scene from traumatic injuries sustained on impact. The junior staff member faced professional consequences, and the manner of death was ruled accidental.